Right, now ladies of the WI, I'm going to show you this object which I think is bronze. Who owns it? You,
Well,
madam?
I don't own it actually.
You don't own it?
No, my partner owns it.
Your partner, so you've stolen it? Yeah, from your partner. Because if it's worth a fortune, he won't know about it, will he? Does anybody know what it is? Napkin ring.
It's a bangle.
It's a bangle, yeah. It's a kind of a bangle, isn't it? I think it is a bangle. Do you want to come up? Let's chat about it. Tell me what you think it is. What do you think it is?
Well, my partner thought that it was some kind of monetary object that was put on a pole, but it was something to do with the slave trade.
Yeah, the slave trade. I think you're right. It's almost slave currency. That's what it is. And yes, you could put it on a pole, but it would be likely to put it on a human being, in truth. I've seen these things before, and this would be for a child. And it's a slave bangle. It's called a Manila bracelet or slave bracelet. It could and sometimes would be worn by a slave to show the wealth of the owner, but these things were indeed currency in Africa and worn in varying sizes to show wealth. So a Manila was as good as any currency today. It could buy you anything from food to land and a house, but primarily they came into existence because of the West African slave trade. You see, European traders were buying slaves from the African slave states along the coast of West Africa. These Africans sold fellow Africans, and they came from opposing tribes generally, but could also be political opponents or unfortunate enemies from their own tribe. Now, of course, European money was of no use, so goods were exchanged for slaves. Everything from pans to jewellery, wooden barrels to weapons. But eventually, the preferred currency was settled upon, and that was the Manila bracelet. Now, you probably know that the British abolished slavery in 1807, the first major power in the world to do so, and by a long way too. It took everyone else a very long time to follow in Britain's footsteps. And the very first empire in the history of the world to end slavery. And from 1807 onwards, the British set up a maritime squadron, the West Africa Squadron, that patrolled the seas for 60 years, bringing the transatlantic slave trade to an end. And the British spent more money on bringing the slave trade to an end than they ever made throughout the slave trade. So a huge expense, and has been described by many over many years as by far the most costly international moral action in modern history. An expense that we as British taxpayers have only just finished paying off. So after very many decades and thousands of lives lost, that trade, the Atlantic African slave trade, was finally brought to an end. But there was another trade, slave trade, going on at the same time, and well into the 19th century. And that was the East Africa slave trade. So it's a trade from Arabia coming into Africa, buying or taking Africans and shipping them off to Asia and Arabia. And it was Dr. David Livingstone, you've heard of him, the Scottish missionary, who gets the credit for bringing the East Africa slave trade to an end. It's a fascinating story. First of all, Dr. David Livingstone, you imagine that this chap was terribly well educated from a rich Scottish family, went to university, studied medicine. Far from the truth. He spent his life in a mill. He worked in the mill from the age of around 10. He had no formal education. His family were poor, but his family did have books, and he was naturally clever, and he devoured the books. And the owner of the mill did have a little schoolroom which the kids were allowed to go and take some basic lessons once they'd done their 12-hour shift. So very few of the children went to the lessons. David Livingstone did. This is how he got his education. He became a missionary. He found himself in Africa, and he was absolutely devastated when he learned of the East African slave trade. And so he was sending letters back to newspapers. And you know the story of Stanley meeting Livingstone in Africa, because Livingstone went missing for several years, and there's stories galore in the paper. Where is he? Where is he? When Stanley found him, Dr. David Livingstone recounted the stories, the experiences he'd witnessed of Arabic slave traders taking the Africans and selling them. Stanley then started writing about it in the American and British press. The American and British and European public were in uproar and insisted that the British, who were the policemen of the seas at the time, do something about it, which they did. The market was in Zanzibar, so the Sultan of Zanzibar was the main trade slaver, I suppose, or Zanzibar certainly was. That little island off the east coast of Africa, this is where all of the slaves that were captured or bought in Africa were shipped to, and this was the big market where buyers, including Europeans, came from around the world trying to, break the British embargo on the slave trade. They're trying to circumnavigate it, would buy the slaves on the island of Zanzibar, and the Sultan and the residents of Zanzibar were making fortunes, absolute eye-watering fortunes from the slave trade that not very many people really knew was going on until David Livingstone and Stanley got the stories out into the West, and then all hell broke loose. So of course the British government were massively pressured, Queen Victoria was involved as well, to do something about the Zanzibar East Africa slave trade. Now, to give them credit, the British government, they had been trying to suppress the trade for very many decades there. Of course they knew it was going on, but they couldn't police every square inch of the world. However, public pressure was so great that Britain threatened the Sultan of Zanzibar with a complete embargo. They said, if you don't cease the slave trade, we will blockade your island, so no slaves can come in, no slaves can leave, but also no other commodities can come in or leave. So in other words, we'll basically starve you out if you don't cease the slave trade. So after some negotiations, they did it. In 1873, a treaty was made between Queen Victoria, the British government, and the Sultan of Zanzibar, the suppression of the East Africa slave trade. And Dr. David Livingstone, with help from the British government and the great British public and American and European public who were demanding it in the newspapers, brought this trade in around 1870 to an end. So again, this is an example of how strange little objects you can handle, and these strange little objects can tell such unbelievable but true stories just in one little bangle. So I believe that's what it is. It's a slave bangle.
It becomes quite chilling, doesn't it?
It does become chilling, but it is history, and we have to look at it, and we have to talk about it, and we have to talk about that time if we're going to learn anything. And the thing is, we don't learn, because did you know that today, as we're here, there are 40 million people in the world living in slavery? So we talk about slavery from the past and we ignore the slavery that's going on today. And I think if an object like that can start that conversation, and us all do a little bit to stop the slavery, stop buying certain objects of clothing, cheap goods. There are slaves that live in this country. Make sure that you don't, support companies that probably and sort of employ or house them. There's something we can do about it today. So my attitude has always been we should stop shouting at history and blaming and pointing the finger and being all virtuous. Stop doing that and start doing something positive today. So if that little object can kick off that conversation, with you as well on YouTube and Facebook, then that's wonderful, and we will probably do some good, won't we?
Thank you, WI ladies, again.
Thank you, WI. Absolutely. Well done, you. Give you a round of applause. A fascinating object.